It's time for the Douglas Coleman Show. Mr. Smooth and Savvy is joined by guests from all walks of life, from the entertainment industry to authors to political and social commentators, the famous and not so famous, the controversial and the light and fluffy. We have it all. Now, here's Douglas Coleman.
Okay, please welcome to the Douglas Coleman Show, Kelly Florence. Hi, Kelly. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for having me. How are you today?
I'm doing fine. Thank you. Thank you for coming on this show. And just looking at your bio, you're an author, screenwriter, podcaster. I want to touch on all of those during the interview. Your latest book, looks like you've got several books out. Your latest book, The Science of Women in Horror, is that the latest one?
That one actually came out in 2020, but it's one that I'm most excited to talk about because it was nominated for a Bram Stoker Award, so we're very proud of that one.
Oh, well, congratulations. How does one get nominated for a Bram Stoker Award? What's the criteria?
So it has to be within the horror genre, and this book is nonfiction. And then members of the Horror Writers Association have to have read it, and then they nominate it, so then you get shortlisted to become possibly on the ballot. We got on the ballot, and so we became finalists, and it was very exciting and a huge honor, especially when it's coming from fellow horror authors. Oh, that's great. So the award is given from your peers then, actually. Exactly. Yeah. Yep, exactly. And it's every May there's the Bram Stoker Award, and it's very prestigious, and so we're very proud. Okay, so when do you find out, when do they do the final? So this one was nominated for the 2020 awards when it came out. So we didn't win, but we were. It was a huge honor to be nominated, and with our peers and by our peers, and now we've got our next book coming out in the fall, and it's called The Science of Witchcraft. So we'll be exploring the science and history of witches throughout books and television shows and movies. Well, you just hit on one of my favorite TV shows, which was Bewitched. Oh yes. Are you going to do any coverage of that show in your book? You know, I think we touched on it a little bit, but there were, as you know, there are countless. There's so many stories and TV shows and movies about witches. We just had to pick our top. I think we did 22 or 23 and focused on those because we could write volumes and volumes about witches. Well, that's true. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk just a little bit about you first. Can you give us just a quick bit of your backstory? Then I want to hit on your podcasts and also a little bit about screenwriting. Sure. So I grew up in northern Minnesota, and I always loved scary things. Ever since I was little, I was drawn to movie monsters like Frankenstein's monster and King Kong. And then I was introduced to Night of the Living Dead. And I really loved all things scary. And so I always was writing little stories and doing research about horror movies because that was what I was drawn to. I ended up I majored in theater and then got my master's in communicating arts and became a communications instructor at a college. But I've always kept that love for horror movies. And so my best friend and I, Meg Hafdahl, we started a podcast. And then now we're working on our 6th book in our series, The Science of Horror. So it's just always been near and dear to my heart, and I'm just thrilled that I get to do this for a living with my best friend. Why do you think horror is such a popular genre? Why do you think people really enjoy seeing blood and guts and people being stabbed to death in the most gruesome ways? I mean, what is that? Well, yeah, I mean, there's definitely that. There's some of that, and I think for me, what I like about scary things, scary stories, or movies or TV shows is that it's a safe way to feel those feelings. It's not that I'm in real peril or I'm really being terrorized by a serial killer. It's seeing it portrayed, and then empathizing with the characters and maybe even working out scenarios like, hey, if I was in this situation, here's what I would do or here's what I wouldn't do. And so I think it's a safe way to feel kind of that fear, which is fun for some people to feel, not everybody, and then just sort of explore through these characters and empathize with them, these extreme situations that we don't necessarily encounter in real life ever.
Do you think there's any validity to the argument that some people have made about horror movies and video games, that it's actually leading kids to act out on these kinds of sort of bizarre, twisted fantasies?
Yeah, we've done a little bit of research on that, and we wrote about it in a couple of our books. And studies have shown it doesn't really lead to violent tendencies. I mean, of course, if you're naturally born or made into a serial killer, that's something different if you're being exposed to extreme things. But for most people, studies have found that watching horror movies, experiencing that fear, going through a scenario with a character, it actually makes you empathize more with that character and expands your worldview so that you can see other people's experiences and empathize, like I said, with people or creatures who are different from you, like Frankenstein's monster or King Kong. It makes you feel something that maybe you hadn't thought about before. Okay.
Well, I'm just thinking about some of the slasher movies from the 70s that were really popular then, like Friday the 13th and, there was a whole bunch of them. Halloween.
Right.
Where it was more grounded in reality. There were no sort of Frankenstein-type monsters. And
right, yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say, I think that those, we're definitely not empathizing with the quote-unquote bad guys there, because there's very little empathy that they had for Michael Myers, like you mentioned. But something that we discovered also through our research, speaking of those slashers, is that a lot of the premises, even though they seem pretty extreme and out there, some of them are based on truth, like Nightmare on Elm Street, Freddy Krueger, who would kill people in their dreams. That was based on a story that Wes Craven read about Hmong immigrants fleeing Laos after the Vietnam War. They came to the United States, and a large number of them were dying in their sleep. And they thought it was from a sleep demon called the Dacha, but medical experts found out that it was because they were suffering from a combination of sudden, unexplained nocturnal death syndrome and cardiac arrhythmia. And so even though, they thought it's this Freddy Krueger-like demon, it had a medical explanation. And so Wes Craven sort of ran with that and said, okay, what if I flip it and that sleep demon was real? So there's always, a little bit of truth to the scary stuff, and sometimes truth can be scarier than fiction.
Well, that's interesting. I'd never heard that before. You wonder if the shock of just coming here after leaving the horrors in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia.
Oh, right, definitely. And I think that, that combining of, cultural beliefs and feeling guilt for leaving their ancestors or their ancestral land, and then, of course, like you said, everything that they've had to go through in order to just immigrate here had to have taken a toll mentally and physically.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So, all right, let me talk a little bit about your podcast. It looks like it says you have two, right? Horror Rewind, and Be a Better Communicator.
Right. So I teach communications at Lake Superior College. So I talk about how to be a better communicator in life, just in general, in certain scenarios on the Be a Better Communicator podcast. And then Horror Rewind is the one that I do with my co-author and best friend. We realized every week, on a weekly basis anyway, we were talking about horror movies that we were watching and the science and history behind them, and sort of how they lived up to our memories of them, if they were old movies, or just, what our opinions of what we thought of them currently. So we decided we'd start a podcast. So every week, it's going on its fifth year now. We talk about something new or old in the world of horror. It could be a book, TV show, movie, whatever we're consuming that week in the world of horror.
Well, I'm happy to hear about the Be a Better Communicator podcast, because it's been one of my rants for a long time, ever since I started doing podcasts, that there are so many podcasts out there, and there's a lot of people who do them simply because they can, because it's sort of like, zero experience necessary. And
Right.
with the technology that's available, all you really need is a microphone and a computer and an internet connection. But not all, there are some really good ones out there, but there have been some that I've listened to that I just thought that these people really didn't have any business doing a podcast because they're not broadcasters and they don't speak well. You got the impression that they just turned the microphone on and just said whatever, that there was no particular purpose to this podcast. And I thought,
Right.
in the other realms of creative expression, writing, authors, filmmaking, musicians, there is a certain level of talent that is necessary in order to do that with any competency. And I think people know better. But with podcasting, it seemed like the bar was set so low that people just thought, I could do this. And,
Yep.
and it's frustrating for people that are trying to do it seriously.
Well, that's true. And I think it definitely is, or it has become the most accessible medium for people to start their own, startup of. But that's something that we pride ourselves in both podcasts, is that, we want to be sharing and helping the audience learn and grow and be relatable and give, real ways to improve your life in some way, whether it be a recommendation for a book or a concept that we're talking about in our books, or how to be a better communicator, how to handle conflict better with your spouse or coworker or another relationship. And so I think I personally like listening to the podcasts and the interviews and all of those things that actually I'm learning something from.
Well, that's good. I appreciate that. And the other thing, you were talking about your Bram Stoker Awards. There is a whole sort of network and groups and organizations that surround authors, right? And there's many different groups, and all of these groups give awards to authors that they feel have excelled in their craft. There really isn't anything like that in podcasting, and I think there should be. I think that's the next place that they need to go, because what they could do is they could give a sort of seal of approval on all of these various podcasts. This podcast is a registered podcast with the blah, 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 blah. And therefore, that there's a certain level of excellence that's associated with that. And it should be from your peer group. It should be from people that are doing it, that they vote and say, oh, yeah, that's a good one. Or no, that one's not. But there's nothing like that. It's still sort of like the Wild West. And,
that's a good point. And
yeah.
I think that there probably is a possibility for that. And I'm wondering, I've kind of heard, since I'm in the communications field and I read about it on a weekly basis, I kind of feel like we've hit the peak of podcasts, maybe, and it'll start dwindling as people switch to another medium like TikTok, for example, that is even more accessible now. You just have to have a phone.
Oh, right. And, it's amazing what you see on TikTok. We haven't ventured into that one yet. We've tried TikTok, but it just doesn't seem to work for us, for this show and for my production company. I'll give you an example. When we tried it, we put up a couple of 1-minute clips of my dogs, and they got lots of hits.
Oh.
But when we did promos for upcoming interview shows, we got nothing.
Yeah. There's a niche to find on TikTok, I think, and some people have really found their audience there. So that's why I feel like I think we probably have hit our peak with podcasts, and the people who think they can do anything will gravitate towards the next medium. Well, that's my prediction anyway.
I hope so. I'm all for that prediction. I really am. Because I've been doing this for 7 years now, and before that I was on FM radio. And it just gets kind of frustrating when there's just so much content out there that you have to try to get your head above the water. And, there's a whole different set of opinions on how one does that, whether it be online marketing, social media. It's a lot of work, and it's something that I can't do because I'm too busy making the product. So it's always been, I'm going to have to hire somebody to do that. And, of course, most people don't work for free, and good online marketing people don't work cheap either. they command a lot of money, which I'm fine with. I think they deserve it if they're good. But, you've got to have the money to invest into that. And then there's no guarantee that it's going to work at all anyways.
Oh, that's true. And I feel like that's sort of the universal struggle for a lot of, I consider broadcasting and art in media. So a lot for authors or filmmakers or writers, podcasters, that it's how do we get to that next level to get heard, to get seen, to, like you said, to be seen as legitimate by our peers so that we can stand out. And I mean, I think that's always the question. So that's why I appreciate the mediums like this, that we can come on and talk about it and get the word out.
It's the never-ending battle. Yeah, it really
right.
is. Let me hit on your screenwriting real quick, and then we got to kind of wind this down. So have you written screenplays? Have they been made into film? Anything that we know?
So nothing yet. We've written several. We have a couple things in pre-production. We've gotten nominated for some awards, and we've been submitting to some other festivals and contests. So this is our newest endeavor, and hopefully exciting things are on the horizon, but nothing we can announce yet.
Okay. How did you find screenwriting? Because I wrote 2, and I made all the mistakes, the newbie mistakes, when I sent them to people who are in the business for review and opinions. They said the same things. They said, you did this, you did this. It's like the same mistakes that all newbies make, where it's too wordy. Where screenwriting is sort of the economy of words. It's the absence of words. And I equated it closer to writing songs, because I'm also a singer-songwriter. Writing a screenplay is more like writing musical lyrics, where every word really needs to count. It's not like writing a novel where you can just ramble on and on, right?
Right. Yeah, my co-writer is a fiction novelist, and so she tends to be very wordy, obviously, as you are in a novel. And then I come from a theater directing background, and so I like to write very technical, like exactly what we're going to see and the angle, because I'm thinking of it from a directorial standpoint. And so we've learned, especially through, feedback, of course, but reading other people's screenplays, exactly that word economy, like you said. Okay, narrow it down. We don't need to describe every single thing. We just have to get to the point and move the story along, because we learned recently at a workshop that every page, that's money from your budget that's going to be made. And if you're too wordy, 1 minute scene might look like it's 5 minutes, and that's a lot more money than a 1 minute scene was, because you were being too wordy. So it's definitely its own art form, and we're still learning.
Yeah, it really is its own art form. And I was told that 1 page on a screenplay is about 1 minute of screen time. Is that the rule of thumb?
Yeah. Yep. Typically, and so that's why even just a new paragraph or a new space, that's adding on time, and time equals budget to a producer who's looking at a script and its length. So keeping that word economy down, and if you're doing a 30-minute TV show for TV, you got to keep it under 30 pages. Yeah,
that's good advice. All right, Kelly. Well, I think we're going to wind this down. Do you have a website that you want to give out?
I do, but I have a personal website for myself, kellyflorence.com, and then all of our books and our podcasts are horrorrewind.com.
Okay. Well, we'll put them both in the show notes. So that
awesome. Thank you so much.
People can find you. And you're on social media, I would assume?
Yep, you can find me under both of those names again, Kelly Florence and Horror Rewind.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. It was nice meeting you, nice talking to you, and best of luck with everything you're doing. Sounds like you've got a full plate like me.
Oh, yeah, very busy, but I'd rather be busy than bored.
I agree with that. All right, Kelly, take care.
You too. Bye.
You're listening to Mr. Smooth and Savvy right here on the Douglas Coleman Show. We'll be right back after these commercial messages.
Douglas Coleman's Don't Do a Podcast is a dryly humorous rant about Douglas's pet peeve the unrelenting torrent of podcasts hitting the web on a constant basis. As technology has put podcasting within the reach of anyone, many wholly unqualified people have taken the plunge. This witty polemic tries to persuade them from broadcasting their drivel using Douglas's brand of sarcastic humor. Now on Amazon, only 99 cents.
DJC Music and DJC Productions are pleased to announce a brand new website. We have started a listing website for radio show hosts as well as potential show guests. This is a meeting site where hosts and guests can come together. Show hosts can list their show and types of guests they're interested in booking. Potential guests can list their talents, bio, accomplishments, or anything they feel makes them an interesting radio show guest. There are no recurrent payments, only a one-time $5 listing fee. Your listing will stay up until you decide to cancel. Previous guests of The Douglas Coleman Show are welcome to submit their guest listing free of charge. Go to radiohostsandguests.com. That's radiohostsandguests.com.
Are you an independent musician? How would you like to have your songs played on hundreds of radio stations just like the one you're listening to right now? Join MusicSubmit.com and we'll promote your music to radio stations and blogs in your genre. It's free to set up your account, and we guarantee your music will be considered for airplay by radio stations worldwide. Why not sign up today? It's free. MusicSubmit.com. Radio promotion for indie musicians.
Hey, this is Ray Powers. Don't touch anything. You've got it right where you need it. Tuned in to The Douglas Coleman Show. You heard me.
Okay, please welcome to the Douglas Coleman Show, Alex Shvartsman. Hi, Alex. How are you?
Hi. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, thank you for coming on the show. Did I get your name right? I just realized I may have mispronounced it.
You actually did. A lot of people mispronounce it, but
Okay.
but you got it right on the money.
All right, good. Well, thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it. And you are here to tell us about a new book that's out or coming. Is it out already?
Today is the release date.
Today.
So
Okay.
I've been enjoying. It's almost like a little version of a birthday when your book comes out. Today is when it hits the bookshelf.
Okay, great. Well, the book is called The Middling Affliction. Is that right?
That's right, and it's the first in a brand new urban fantasy series called the Conradverse Chronicles, and it's a story of magical Brooklyn. I've lived in Brooklyn for over 30 years, and I wanted to write a story that's urban fantasy, that's not in some generic city or around really famous landmarks, but in the streets and parks and buildings that I frequent. And so much of the story takes place in South Brooklyn, in Sheepshead Bay, in Midwood, and then the characters do get out to other places as well, but that's really the core setting of the story.
Okay. So urban fantasy, explain what that is for people that don't know what that genre is about.
Urban fantasy are fantastical stories that are set in our world, but with an addition of magic and various often trope characters. So things like vampires, werewolves, wizards, anything that you might find. So, for example, Blade would be an urban fantasy. Highlander would be an urban fantasy. The Dresden Files, Supernatural. Those are all examples of the urban fantasy genre.
Okay. So what time frame does this story take place, your book? Is it in present day?
Yes, it is in modern day, and it's a slightly different timeline. So you have some characters and some references that refer to real-world events and places, and some that are somewhat changed. For example, our characters are quite fond of popular culture, so they're aware of Star Wars and various comic books and things, and they'll make references and crack jokes about them. But at the same time, certain things have gone differently.
The picture I have of the book cover is very small. It's almost like a thumbnail. So I see a bunch of people on the cover, but I can't really make them out. Are they human beings or are they other types of beings?
So the 5 characters depicted on the cover are all human. They are guardians of the watch. Essentially, they're people with magic whose job it is to protect regular people against malevolent magic, monsters, etc. And each of them is in charge of protecting their borough of New York City. And as you probably know, there are 5 different boroughs. So the main character, Conrad Brent, is the protector of Brooklyn, while each of the other characters takes care of Manhattan, Queens, Staten Island, and the Bronx.
Okay. What kind of monsters are they fighting?
Everything from, again, from vampires and werewolves to any kind of various incursions by less common creatures. For example, at the very beginning of the story, the main character is asked to take care of a demon who made residence in a warehouse by the water where he can, in Sunset Park. Of course, he finds out it's not actually a demon, but a harmless creature that's masquerading as a demon. And it's capable of projecting this horrendous visage in order to protect itself. So there's all sorts of, critters, but most of the problems that they have are with other human beings who are using magic for nefarious means.
Okay, so can anyone use magic in your story? I mean, they have the ability to do that?
Not at all. So the way that the world building is set up, 1 in every 30,000 people approximately has the gene that allows them to perceive magic and to cast spells. The rest of us, our brains tend to edit reality in order to essentially protect us from recognizing the supernatural. So for the people who are not read in, if they see a big burly troll walking by, in their mind they'll think it's just a large biker. And so if they see a duel of magics, they'll think that people are using flamethrowers instead of firing fireballs. So essentially, a regular person who is not gifted, which is what the people who with magic are referred to as a gifted in the series, the regular person will mostly avoid recognizing what's going on unless they're specifically read in.
Have you had other novels published, or is this your first one?
I have. My first novel came out several years ago, and it was called Eridani's Crown. It was a very different story, whereas The Middling Affliction is humorous. The first book was grimdark, so it was sort of the aesthetic of Game of Thrones, and it was also a medieval secondary world fantasy with lots and lots of politics and giant battles and things like that. I have also been writing short stories for well over a decade. I've had over 120 shorter pieces published in all sorts of popular science fiction and fantasy magazines. So I kind of learned my writing techniques on the short stories, and then only in the recent few years started writing novels.
Do you do this full time, or do you have something else you do as well?
I do not. My full-time job is actually running the largest game shop in New York City.
Oh.
Of course, I name drop the shop in my book because I can, because it's mine, and that's what I do for a living. And I get to write on weekends and in the evenings, and whenever I can spare a couple of hours, which is why my output is at best a book a year.
You say game shop, so this is video games?
No, these are the traditional board games, trading card games, miniatures, things like that. So non-electronic games.
Oh, non-electronic games. Oh, okay. And there's a good market for that?
Settlers of Catan, Sorry, go ahead.
I said, is there a good market for that? I mean, kids still want to play board
Absolutely.
games? Yeah?
Absolutely. Trading cards in particular are very, very popular. Pokemon, for example, I'm sure you've heard of it. Pokemon cards are very hot, and children and adults are both looking to collect them. So there's a lot of people shopping for those, and there's loads of other games that are quite popular. The one I mentioned, Settlers of Catan, has been pretty much the number one board game for about 20 years now. Among the people who kind of are familiar with these strategy games, and not just Monopoly and Battleship and the more popular older children's games.
Okay.
These do quite well.
Is Monopoly still around?
Monopoly is still around. It's just that if a game designer tried to pitch Monopoly to a manufacturer today, they would get left out of the room. It's just too expensive, too complicated. There are too many components. The gameplay is clunky. The reason Monopoly is so popular still is because it's generational. Grandparents teach it to their grandkids, and when the children grow up, they teach it to their grandkids, and so on. So the game it has so much, it has so much recognition that so many people know it by name that when, hey, we want to do a game night, what do you think of? You think of Monopoly, and then you go to Target and you pick up a copy. But it's not a game that is very modern. It's kind of like, reading a pulp novel from the 1920s. There's still value to it, but it's not something that would get published today.
Well, I mean, I haven't played that game since I was a kid, and I have tried the online version of it, which is good if you want to play alone, because the computer will play against you. You can't really play the board game alone.
Right, and it takes, you can't really play it with two people either, not very well. So you need a group, and you need a lot of time, and then the game can get bogged down quite a bit. It's grindy is the term that the game designers would use, because you're just doing the same thing over and over again, and you're not really making very many decisions, right? Because generally, if you land on a property that nobody bought yet, you're going to buy it, and that's the strategy of the game. Very rarely will you actually make a decision not to buy it for some reason. So there isn't. You're just kind of following the instructions that the game gave you rather than thinking.
Yeah, that's true. And actually, the only reason you wouldn't buy it is if you didn't have the money to buy it, and you didn't want to mortgage off something that you've already bought. Yeah, there was kind of a limitation to that game, in a sense. And you're right, it could go on forever, because if you had four people playing and they owned equal amounts of property, and you went around and around, then it just became the luck of the dice. After a while.
It does, and it could take a really long time before somebody has an unlucky enough streak to get eliminated.
Right.
So it's just not a very well designed game, and it's kind of like playing a computer game from the 1980s now. Where like they may have had really good ideas, but the graphics are not going to be good, and you would rather play a sleek, modernized version of that. And that's what the current slew of board games is like. I mean, there's just everything and type that you can possibly imagine, and the ones that are based on like most of the book and comic book properties and films that if you want those. So if you want to play like a Star Wars game, there's those. If you want to play a Lord of the Rings games, they all exist, and they're generally very well designed because it's become an established. I don't know what you want to call it, art form or craft or whichever term you wish to apply. We stand on the shoulders of giants. Like people have figured out a lot of interesting things about board game design since the days of Monopoly, and anybody working in the field today will generally be familiar with these newer games and will not repeat the mistakes of the past.
Let me get back to your book for a second. So the Middling Affliction, you said, is the first book in a series. How many books are going to be in the series? Do you know yet?
I have a plan for a trilogy. So there is... Now, first of all, let me say one thing which really annoys me as a reader. I hate it when I get to the end of the book and I am left essentially mid-story. Like there's no resolution. Somebody sells me half a book and expects me to wait a year for the next half. I'm not doing it that way. Every book in the series tells you a complete story. And then there's the connecting, overarching threads that make it an even more satisfying experience if you read all three. So you will get a satisfying resolution by the end of the book, and you don't have to go and wait until the next one comes out or be on the hook for it, because I believe that if you like it enough, you will pick up the sequel anyway. Now the world is set up in such a way that there's an opportunity to write plenty more books, but I've always envisioned it initially as a trilogy, and that's the story I'm going to tell, and then we shall see.
Well, it's interesting because I do a lot of interviews with authors, and I've had authors on who have written a 2-book series and some that have written a 20-book series. And I never know how they decide how long the series is going to run, with the exception of maybe they just run out of ideas.
I think it's pretty hard to run out of ideas, but people tend to think that an idea is the most important element of the book. Is as long as they have this amazing idea, they will have a bulletproof plan. Like, they'll have a book that everybody's going to want to read. But that's not true. I can come up with 5 ideas a day, every day for the rest of my life. I will just never have time to write those ideas. The difficult part is the few months or a year or sometimes multiple years that it'll take to turn that idea into an actual book. So when people are envisioning a series, a lot of the time it comes down to them having some kind of an overarching an overarching plot, a story that they want to tell, and each story has its own length. You kind of when you sit down and you envision a story, you kind of have an idea of how long it's going to be, because there are some things that you can tell in a short story that's going to take 5-10 minutes to read, and there's some things where you need a novella, and there's some things where you need a 5-book series. But authors also change their minds. Peter F. Hamilton has envisioned some of his works as trilogies and then ended up writing them as 2-book series, for example, as something that I've listened to as audiobooks recently. So everybody kind of has their own plan, and then there's the commercial aspect of it. If the publisher is not making enough money, they may say, "Okay, that's it. The next book is going to be your last." If you're lucky, if you're unlucky, they'll just cancel the series, without that warning. So sometimes the authors are forced to react to that, and then continue the series on their own as self-published authors, or just wrap things up really quickly, just like a TV series, where like when they cancel the series and all of a sudden the last couple of episodes just sort of really quickly run through, try to tie up whatever loose ends they could. That happens in books too.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, Alex. Well, we do have to wind this down. Thank you so much for coming on. Do you have a website you want to give out?
Thank you very much. Yes, my website is just my name, so if you can put it in the story notes, it's alexshvartsman.com, which is a little difficult to spell, but people can Google that, or just Google the Middling Affliction, and it will most certainly come up. And I have lots of other books and short stories and translations, so I do hope that if your listeners heard something today that they found interesting, they'll check out those works.
Well, again, thank you for coming on. It was nice meeting you, nice talking to you, and best of luck with the book. Congratulations that today was the release date, and I hope it does well.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity. Have a great day.